This week's module focuses on the challenges facing Europeans in the aftermath of World War I. The twin crises of the massive death toll and the crisis of confidence in the notion of civilization led to anxieties in the post-war period. The outcome of the war contributed to the collapse of numerous empires and the push towards notions of nationalism within Europe, while at the same time also leading to the expansion of the victorious empires of Britain and France. Anxieties in this period were not merely political, but also cultural, as women took on new social roles and presented a different image that challenged the established notion of separate spheres. Economic challenges of the post-war period were amplified by the Treaty of Versailles and would create a near collapse of the German economy and undermine the efforts to establish democracy there. The war ended in 1918 with a revolution in Germany. The new German government sued for peace, although Germany still occupied French territory and had held against the renewed Allied offensive and had defeated the Russians already. The end of the war brought two new crises in Europe. One, a demographic crisis, and two, a crisis of civilization. The first was a product of the magnitude of death and dismemberment as a result of the war. 1.5 million British, 3 million French, 4 million Germans. These figures were coupled with deaths from diseases that followed the war, particularly a strand of Spanish influenza that was a global epidemic in 1919. There was a brief decline in birth rates as a result, which caused great anxiety in Western societies concerned with rebuilding after the war. Coupled with this was the continued presence of women in the labor force, a trend that had increased during the war and that has caused cultural critics to decry how women needed to stay home to help repopulate states. In terms of the crisis of civilization, critics again pointed to how Western civilization's alleged superiority was challenged by the reality of the war. Also, the traumas of the war, dismemberment and shell shock, suggested a frailty that had not been understood to be part of war. Lastly, the failure of war to end decisively caused problems among states, even as Germany would be punished. The end of the war transformed the landscape of Europe. 4 major empires were dissolved and new states were to be established, illustrating how nationalism continued to be a force after the war. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points were a guiding force in the reconstruction of Europe after the war, especially his idea of national self-determination. Out of these empires, over a dozen new states were established. These new states are shown in green on this map. Look at where these states lay, mainly in Eastern Europe. This would be the problematic area for World War II. At the same time as some empires were dissolving, the victorious Allies expanded their empires, particularly in the areas formerly controlled by the Ottoman Empire. While the central area of that empire, Turkey, modernized and attempted to develop itself as a Western state, the remainder of the area was divided between France and Britain into mandates, and thus the area known as the Middle East was created. These mandates were to be shepherded into independent states, but were effectively integrated into the British and French empires. The Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended the war, was constructed in a way that blamed Germany for the war, despite the complex beginnings that we've studied. German war guilt was established in the treaty, which Germany signed, and Germany was forced to pay reparations to France and Britain. Also, Germany was dismembered, and parts of the state were given to its neighbors, which would cause problems in the coming decades. Essentially, the treaty was punitive and created tensions between Germany and its former enemies. Even as European states were established out of the defeated empires, many subjects within the British and French empires looked to the idea of national self-determination as one applicable to parts of the empire. For example, Ho Chi Minh sought to apply this idea for the Vietnamese, while Indians hoped for freedom after contributing to the British war effort. Both of these ideas were rebuked, although the British did offer autonomy to its white settler colonies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, in exchange for their service to the empire during the war. As the 1920s continued, cultural anxieties were manifest in fashion, the arts, and the increased presence of women in politics. These experiences led many men to criticize the enfranchisement of women. After the war, women gained the right to vote in Britain, the United States, and the new states established in the East. Many men were concerned about how women would vote, but married women often voted along the same political lines as their spouses, while conservatives were able to court the female vote through connections with religion. Still, women constituted a challenge to social norms, especially with the appearance of the so-called new woman. With women working more and not being married, they were able to spend their wages on themselves, which helped bolster economies of many states. Women's clothes and hairstyles took on a more androgynous form, and new forms of dancing inflamed social critics who were concerned about the collapse of morality. Artists responded to the war in myriad ways, but the appearance of non-representational art in the movements of Dada and Surrealism illustrate the effects of war on culture. After the destruction of the war, many artists abandoned traditional forms and tried new styles that reflected the chaos and confusion of the post-war period. During this period, the war had expanded the role of the government in all of the states, leading to the creation of the welfare state. After the war, these states had promised to care for their citizens with expanded programs. In several states, socialist parties won elections on a platform of government aid. However, the economies of most states, including France and Germany, were unable to maintain these programs, but at the same time could not outright end them. The tension between expectations and reality was evident in the phenomenon of hyperinflation, which swept through Germany in 1923 and 24. The German mark, a solid currency of the late 19th century, survived the war as a stable currency. However, the cost of state programs and reparations led the German government to attempt to deal with these two problems through the printing of money. Here are a few examples of how quickly this problem got out of hand. On this slide is a 20 mark note, a common denomination in 1920. By late 1923, it is replaced with a 20,000 mark note. By 1924, it's replaced with a 50 million mark note. As another example, look at this chart detailing the cost of a postage stamp. What was a tenth of a mark for decades, in the space of a few years, skyrocketed to the cost of 200 billion marks to send a postcard. Indeed, burning money became common as the paper was worth more as fuel than as the note itself. The collapse of the German economy set off turmoil throughout Europe. Most importantly, hyperinflation destroyed the wealth and security of the German middle class, which was supportive of the new democratic regime. After hyperinflation, marginal political parties became more successful in courting voters, which would have a greater effect in the coming of the next war.